Welcome to Murder Most Foul, a podcast devoted to exploring famous murder cases of our time. Some solved, some unsolved, but all fascinating and guaranteed to raise the hairs on the back of your neck. I'm your host, Jim Solanowski. Today's episode: Murder Castle. Herman Webster Mudgett, better known as H. Holmes, was an American serial killer who hunted in Chicago in the late 1890s, around the time of the World's Fair. Holmes was a killer, con artist, and trigamist, and the subject of over 50 lawsuits in Chicago alone. Holmes was executed on May 7, 1896, 9 days before his 35th birthday. DFEPRAVED is a fascinating true crime book on the life of H. Holmes. The book's author, Dr. Harold Schechter, joins me now. Good afternoon, Dr. Schechter.
Good afternoon. Thank you for inviting me on.
Now, Holmes is historically classified as a serial killer, although he bends the current definition a little bit that stated a person, quote, who murders 3 or more people, usually in the service of abnormal psychological gratification. Now, he certainly killed 3 or more people, often very cruelly, but most of his murders had to do with financial gain or to get out of legal trouble.
I do agree that the term serial killer, when it first was coined, and it was actually coined, I have since discovered, back in 1930s, to describe a notorious, what they used to call lust murderer, named Peter Curtin. But the people to whom it was first applied in this country, Bundy and Dahmer and John Wayne Gacy, etc. Again, these were all people who previously, kinds of criminals who previously would have been called lust murderers. That is to say, you know, they committed their atrocities in the service of very, very perverse sexual needs. You know, they were sex murderers. It's true that Holmes does not fit into that category. You know, he was not a sexual mutilation murderer or somebody who derived, again, perverse sexual pleasure from torturing his victims and murdering his victims, as Jack the Ripper, obviously. Well, Jack the Ripper didn't torture his victims, but he was obviously a mutilation murderer. So in that sense, Holmes does not fit into that category. On the other hand, there's no doubt that he must have derived some sort of depraved gratification from committing the kinds of crimes he did. You know, there have been some serial killers who kind of combine a mercenary motive with these deeper aberrant psychological drives. And I think Holmes fits into that particular category of serial murder.
So let's get to know H. Holmes.
Well, Holmes was born Herman Mudgett in a small New Hampshire town, Gilmanton, New Hampshire. You know, I was just talking about this with some other people. You know, until they become infamous, criminals like Holmes, these very notorious criminals, lead very obscure lives. You know, I mean, they're not particularly documented. So many tales about Holmes' early years that have come down to us are of questionable reliability. You know, there are these stories about his, you know, having displayed some of the classic signs of serial murder as a child, torturing animals, for example. And there was a story told after he was arrested that he might have pushed one of his playmates to death. You know, none of that has been documented, and most of it has been called into serious question. He was obviously a very intelligent person. He seems to have been a person of a good deal of glib charm. He was, in most respects, he fits into the classic category of a psychopath. Somebody with above average intelligence, but who possesses nothing like a human conscience or capacity for empathy, who thinks only of his own needs and is ready and willing and able to exploit other human beings, again, for his own egotistic purposes. He did attend medical school and received a medical degree. At some point, he moved to Philadelphia, where he found work as a pharmacist. Again, there's some question about what it was at that point, by the way, he changed his name to Holmes. And he appears to have gotten into some difficulty when he was a pharmacist. Again, the details are a little unclear. Supposedly he prescribed the wrong medication for a patient that led to that person's death. We do know that in the late 1800s, he ended up in Chicago, where he got a job in a pharmacy run by a guy named Holton and his wife. And he eventually took over that pharmacy. Again, there were these stories that he might have been responsible for murdering Holton and then murdering his wife. And at some point, he sold the pharmacy to a young man, and then he promptly began a relationship with the young man's wife, whose name was Julia. Holmes, again, did seem to exert a great deal of appeal on the opposite sex, as it was called back in those days. So he was actually, he was married simultaneously at various points to different women. Among other things, he was a bigamist. Anyway, Holmes has come down to us in history, and I would even say cultural mythology, for having constructed on a corner opposite the original Holton's pharmacy of a large, somewhat rambling building, an office building primarily, that came to be known as the Castle of Horrors. Let me just say, before we proceed further, that at the time Holmes' crimes were discovered, this was the heyday of what was called the Yellow Press. The Yellow Press was the precursor of 20th century tabloid culture. And, the great pioneers of the Yellow Press were Joseph Pulitzer and William Randolph Hearst. And their newspapers, like the tabloids of the 20th century, trafficked in extreme sensationalism. And their unspoken motto was also, never let the truth get in the way of a good story. So, when you read the newspaper articles about Holmes and his castle, you really have to take them with a very large, well, more than a grain, probably a tablespoon of salt. This was right around the time of the Great Chicago World's Fair of 1893 and 94. The castle, when you see pictures of it, it just looks like this big building. Not even that impressive a building at the time, because Chicago, having recovered from the Great Fire of 1873, was in the midst of this huge building boom and erecting all these skyscrapers. Holmes' castle was 3 stories high. The bottom floor was devoted to various businesses. There were some rooms on the second floor. He did build a 3rd floor, supposedly as a hotel for visitors to the World's Fair. He designed the castle himself, and one consequence of that is that the interior, was very weird and eccentric and contained all these architectural features that you would not find in a building designed by a professional architect.
In your book, you do detail some of the features of the room. You state that most of the rooms had been rigged with gas pipes connected to the control panel in Holmes's bedchamber, and the doors to these rooms could be locked only from the outside. And then there were other equally sinister features of the second story: secret passageways, concealed closets, accessible through sliding panels, trap doors opening up into darkness, and large greased shafts that led straight to the cellar. And down there we had acid tanks, quicklime vats, dissecting table, surgeon's cabinet, and the other gruesome tools of the trade. And one of the more fascinating things, that there was a contraption called, Holmes called an elasticity determinator. That it was a technological marvel whose purpose was to produce a race of giants by stretching experimental subjects to twice their normal length. But those who viewed it up close, it appeared more to be just a medieval torture rack. And last but not least, a large walk-in safe that you might find in a bank somewhere.
Holmes had this very large walk-in safe installed in the building, and then once it was there, refused to pay for it. And apparently, again, he was a con man. We know this from recent events. I mean, there are a lot of building construction people who put up these buildings and then don't pay their workers. But anyway, Holmes would hire workers and then fire them for some flimsy excuse, never pay them. Well, he had this big safe installed and then refused to pay for it. And when the company said they were going to take it out, he said, "Be my guest, but then I'll, sue you, for damaging the building." So, but apparently he employed this safe as a kind of death chamber, and he would again lure or somehow manage to lock some of his victims into the safe and then take pleasure in their slow death, starvation, suffocation, whatever.
Now, aside from allegedly getting rid of wives, mistresses, and business complications at the castle, legend has it that he rented out rooms to guests at the World's Fair and would rob and then dispatch folks using the medieval features of his castle. But one of his major cons, which to me ended up being his most heartless, is not in dispute and involved a fellow con man named Benjamin Pitezel and Mr. Pitezel's unwitting family.
Holmes was a very enterprising person, and he was a very clever person, diabolically clever in certain ways, and he was a person of enormous energies. And if he had not been undone, again, by his own psychopathology, he was living in the Gilded Age when the culture worshipped these businessmen, and these self-made millionaires. Somebody like Holmes probably could have been a great success. Again, that he was undone by this psychopathology, which ultimately led to his destruction. And that's what happened with the scheme with Pitezel. They decided that they would pull this off in Philadelphia, which was in proximity to the insurance company that issued the policy that they had taken out on Peitzel's life. And Peitzel went there. Peitzel was something of an inventor. He set up an office, kind of patent office. Supposedly, he was going to die in a fire. Holmes was going to supply a corpse, presumably because he had connections to other doctors who had these dissection specimens. Holmes was going to get hold of one. They were going to substitute this charred corpse for Peitzel's body, collect all this money. I forget the exact amount, but it was a substantial sum. Anyway, Peitzel went along with this. So Peitzel, by the way, was married with 5 children. He left his wife and kids in Chicago. Told his wife that if she read anything about him in the newspapers, that he died and stuff, don't worry, it wasn't true.
But Holmes never intended to find a cadaver to pass off as the dead body, but indeed was planning to kill Peitzel all along.
For a whole variety of reasons, not the least of which was Holmes would come into twice as much money. And also, get rid of somebody who might conceivably turn on him or, get drunk and reveal what he had done. So Holmes ended up killing Peitzel and setting this fire to disfigure Peitzel's corpse. And then he went, and this, I think, illustrates what happened next really illustrates the true depth of Holmes's depravity. Earlier victims, Julia Smith, for example, who was one of his mistresses, who ended up dead in the castle. But there can be no question that what Holmes did with Peitzel and the family, reveal a profoundly unhinged, kind of psychology. Holmes went back to Chicago and knowing that he needed a family member to identify the corpse, brought back with him Peitzel's oldest daughter, and he brought with him 2 other children, and he arranged with Carrie that they would all meet up after all this stuff was resolved, but they needed to split up for now.
And so Holmes uses Peitzel's daughter to identify the charred remains of her father.
And then Holmes set out on this kind of remarkable odyssey in which he took the children, from one place to another, one city to another, up into Canada. Meanwhile, simultaneously keeping Carrie promising Carrie that they would all be reunited, including her husband, Benjamin, telling his wife, Carrie, that they would all meet up at some point. But every time she arrived, at this rendezvous point, Holmes made some excuse for why she couldn't join up with her husband and the other kids. They were under surveillance. It was too risky. Let's do it in Niagara Falls. Let's do it here. Let's do it there.
And not to mention the fact that he's hiding from his own wife, his current wife at the time, Georgiana. He's got her stashed away, and he's convincing her that he's doing business around the country selling, new technology, copying machines to the railroad.
He was this incredible puppet master. Who was able to keep all these balls in the air, well, to mix my metaphors, simultaneously. And again, he had known these kids for years. They saw him as like Uncle Howard, sort of. And, under the guise of taking care of them and being solicitous of their needs. And, when they got bored, taking them to the zoo, the whole time he was just plotting how best to get rid of them, which he ultimately did. He ultimately murdered all three of the children in different places, in different locations, so that presumably their bodies would never be found and never be able to be, and if they were, never connected to him.
According to your book, the two sisters, Alice and Nellie, were forced into a large trunk with a hole in the back where a gas hose was put through, and they were asphyxiated while Holmes stood there calmly waiting for it to be over. Their brother Howard, who had disappeared, I believe, some months before, and the two sisters didn't know where he had been taken, was his body, his remains were found sometime later by a detective in a chimney.
So the Pinkertons, were following Holmes, and they finally arrested him just before he was about to leave the country. And he basically thought he was just being arrested on some relatively minor charge. He claimed the kids were fine. They were with these different accomplices. And then the Chicago police set one of their ace detectives, a guy named Frank Geyer, on the trail. And Geyer ended up locating the bodies of all three children. Yes, so Holmes is captured. Again, he thinks it's, for some, relatively trivial scheme he pulled off. He kept insisting for a long time that Peitzel was still alive, that the kids were fine, that they were with an accomplice, a female accomplice who was taking care of them. Poor, Peitzel's wife, Carrie, is undergoing, this increasing breakdown because she just wants to see her kids again, and she keeps being assured that she will. When Detective Geyer, who has discovered the corpses of her children, when it has to be finally broken to her that the kids are dead, well, her reaction is easy to imagine. At that point, the newspapers, the yellow press, leap on this story, and Holmes becomes this really nationwide and even international phenomenon. It's interesting. One of the interesting facets of the case was seeing how, first of all, the fascination with sensational crime stories, which, is easy to believe might be a function of the world we live in today, has been a perennial feature of culture, that people have always been fascinated with sensational murders. The only thing that's changed is, the means of technological transmission. In the pre-electronic era, these stories were told through print. So Holmes was immediately portrayed as the reincarnation of Bluebeard, Bluebeard, the famous fairy tale character who murdered his wives and kept their corpses in a secret bloody chamber. And that was the point at which reporters finally entered into Holmes's building, Holmes's premises. And this is when stories began to, be promulgated that this was, again, a medieval torture castle with this torture dungeon, and all these stories. So, yeah, Holmes was elevated into the front ranks of all American monsters. And ultimately he was convicted of Peitzel's murder. while he was in prison awaiting his execution, again, he was offered a substantial sum. But one interesting thing about Holmes is that he had maintained a close relationship with his second wife, Myrta, with whom he'd had a child. And you sometimes find that with serial killers, even some of the most sadistic and heinous, is that they will have family lives and their families never suspect them, being the kind of person capable of these atrocities. And they sometimes are, not always, but sometimes are, relatively decent spouses and fathers and so on. So Holmes, did have something approaching human feelings for his second wife. And, so when Hearst offered him, I think something like, well, a substantial sum of money, I want to say $5,000, but I don't know if it was that.
I think it was 5,000 maybe.
He knew he was going to be able to leave it to Myrta and his daughter. So he concocted this confession, which was really based on a lot of the stories that the Yellow Press had already invented about him. And he portrayed himself, as the greatest, most devilish killer who had ever lived, and so on and so on and so forth. And, that is the way he had entered into, and to some extent has continued to remain in our cultural imagination.
So, despite the subtitle to your book, Depraved, the shocking true story of America's first serial killer, since writing the book and time passing, you have done research and feel he technically was not America's first serial killer. So who was?
Well, it's hard to know. I'm sure there were many what we would now call serial killers in our history that we have no idea. I mean, back in the old days, if you were a psychopath, homicidal psychopath, and were a white man, you can go butcher as many Native Americans as you wanted, and you wouldn't be penalized for it. You might get a medal for it. But there were a couple of cousins, I guess. They're often called brothers, known as the Harps, back in the 18th century, who apparently committed a whole string of butcheries. There were, again, the book I referred to before, the Psycho USA, when I was researching that, came across a number of classic serial sex killers who preceded Holmes, who preyed on young women and sexually mutilated them and so on and so forth. The thing about serial murder, the phrase serial murder is a relatively recent coinage. Again, I was able to determine that it was first used in Weimar Germany in the 1930s to describe a guy named Peter Kürten, again, who was a classic lust murderer. And then in our own country, it really didn't enter into the language until the early 1980s. I believe it was first used in print in the New York Times to refer to the Atlanta child murders, which I think were 1982. But the phenomenon itself has always existed as a feature of, human behavior, probably even predates our species, because, as I'm sure we're genetically very close to chimpanzees. We share more DNA with chimpanzees than chimpanzees share with gorillas. And chimpanzees, even though, I think of them as like cheetah, Tarzan's buddy cheetah, but, they're insanely violent creatures who, routinely engage in kinds of violent behavior that, is like the worst of any serial killer. So human beings have always, serial murder has always been, been part. I mean, the fairy tale character Bluebeard is presumably based on an actual French aristocrat, Gilles de Rais, who tortured and murdered an indeterminate number of children and so on. So yeah, in our own country, I'm sure there are, all too many what we would now call serial killers before Holmes.
Now, the character Norman Bates in the movie Psycho was actually based on a real-life serial killer, wasn't he?
And also the character Buffalo Bill in Silence of the Lambs were all inspired by the crimes of a guy named Edward Gein, which is spelled Gein.
So to finish up, Holmes went to the gallows fairly calmly and leaving very specific instructions as to his burial, didn't he?
Oh, yeah. So Holmes left specific instructions before his execution that he be buried in a grave that was lined with a concrete vault because he was afraid that his own body might be exhumed and end up on the dissection table. I mean, Shakespeare, felt the same way. On his gravestone, there's a very famous epitaph where he, warns potential grave robbers away from disturbing his bones.
And if you'll indulge me, the words on Shakespeare's tombstone read, "Good friends, for Jesus' sake forbear to dig the bones enclosed here. Blessed be the man that spares these stones, and cursed be he that moves my bones." And on that very literary note, I think it's time to say goodbye to our guest on Murder Most Foul today, Harold Schechter. We've been discussing his book, Depraved. And Harold, why don't you tell my audience how they can learn more about you, your books, and maybe even get in contact you if they'd like?
One good way of getting information is on my Wikipedia page, which has just been revised and brought up to date. I do have a website that I never visit called haroldschechter.com. And I also have a Facebook page, which I also never visit, which is kept from me. But it's kept for me by somebody who then does, transmit to me any messages that I get. And, just today I got several. And I'm always happy to receive them and reply to them. So
great. I'm hoping after this is up, you're going to get a lot more. So again, I want to thank you so much. I'm going to be looking for your next book, which is out soon. So everyone should keep an eye out for Maniac, which is going to be on the stands, or at least published. See how quickly it gets to the booksellers. But it will be published on the 9th of March. Yeah. So that's great. And again, I want to thank you again, Harold Schechter, for spending time with us.
Thank you. It's been a delight. Thank you.
Of course, I want to thank you, my listeners, to Murder Most Foul. And if you enjoyed today's podcast, I hope you'll listen to others on my podcast site. And of course, they can be downloaded from any of your favorite music platforms. And please tell your friends. And if you'd like to leave me a comment, always looking for comments, pros and cons, and also maybe even tips on a murder that I'm not familiar with that you'd like to see me cover. And you can do that on my website, which is www.murdermostfoul, all one word, no caps, no spaces, .com. And until we meet again, stay safe and stay healthy.